live. Oh, we're live. Hi, Shira. Welcome to Venture with Grace.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Great being here.
Amazing. Okay, so to start off the show, I would like to give a quick shout out to our sponsor. So this episode is brought to you by LG Nova. Get ready to ignite your passion for innovation at the fourth annual InnoFest, happening at the iconic Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco on September 25th and 26th. This two-day event brought to you by LG Nova is your chance to dive into the future with industry leaders and cutting edge startups shaping health tech, AI, clean tech, life science, smart life, mobility, and more. And here's something extra special. I'll be hosting a panel at InnoFest guiding a dynamic discussion on the future of AI and workforce. Join me along with other thought leaders as we explore the trends and technologies driving innovation and positive change. Don't miss out on this unique opportunity to be part of the conversation and help create a brighter, more innovative tomorrow. Register today at innofest.alginova.com and be part of the movement at InnoFest 2024. Okay, so to start the show, I would love for the audience to get to know you a little bit more. So you have worked at the Israel uh, military. I don't know if it's like if we should just call it like, so you have worked with the Israel Air Force and you were a pilot. To start the show, I feel like that experience seems like what shaped a lot of like how you think about things and like standing out in a male dominant industry. Why don't we start there and then maybe we could dive into your journey and venture
Yeah,
later.
great. So indeed, I served for 8.5 years at the Israeli Air Force. I still do reserves as a flight instructor in Flight Academy. It's one of the things that has shaped me the most, and an organization that I'm proud to be part of. It's also a very male dominant environment, as you just mentioned. So we started Flight Academy, 17 women cadets, and I was the only one to graduate. So it was also kind of a challenging journey for me to kind of finish without any female friend, and also to kind of to need to cope with this environment and make changes in order to finish the course, which is, by the way, 3 years, and is quite challenging. And then also in the rest of my service. So I think, and I must say that I'm proud to be part of this organization, and I have many of my best friends serve in the Israeli Air Force. So I never felt like people were trying to, to make my journey more difficult, or didn't want to have women next to them. That's not the case, at least not in the Israeli Air Force. It's more about the environment just being difficult for minorities to be part of. And I think that I learned many lessons, but one of them is that it's indeed people were not against me; they were in
Mhm.
favor of my success. It's just that when the system has its own ways and it's very male dominant, there are some habits and some practices that require change, and it's not easy to increase the awareness for that and to change that.
I feel you. I feel like sometimes it's also like a mindset to like come through with like a program that like you being the only person that come from like a certain background and like having a certain skill set that maybe people didn't like notice. And like I wonder when it comes to like later on you worked on your own like NGO before you joined Vintage and you work at like the big consulting firm McKinsey. So like why don't we chat a little bit about like, what were some lessons that you've learned in like consulting and NGO that you took now being investor as like as a person who invests in fund of funds, secondary and um like growth stage.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. So first of all, I'd say that I served for 8.5 years, and then when I was
Mhm.
27, I left and I went to do a year of like 1 year traveling. Didn't work. Went to New Zealand, to Japan, even to Armenia. I did a trek there.
Mhm.
And I think people often don't mention it as something that has shaped them and they learned, and it's not in their
Mhm.
CV. But this year was actually one of the most kind of important years in my development. Just taking time off, reading books, listening to music, meeting people from all over the world. even doing like difficult tracks and dealing with uncertainty and things like that. So that was super insightful and important. Then I did actually my master's in Oxford, and that was and I did it in sustainability, which has led me to kind of today lead our investments in climate. And that was also a very shaping experience because it was the first time that I left and lived somewhere else that is not Israel. And
Mhm.
again, I met people from all over the world, and I also realized what Israel looks like from the outside, and what international affairs look from the outside, and also just studying in a university that is like 700 and something years old, which is quite
Mhm.
impressive. And then I did 1 year internship with the Israeli government, 18 months with McKinsey, and another year in an NGO. So I tried all worlds before I joined Vintage 5 years ago. Um, and I think so, like McKinsey, the main things I took from there is the fact that every problem is solvable if you break it down to
Mhm.
small enough pieces and you structure it. That was a very important lesson. In addition to learning how to make slides and how to make Excel models, but just this confidence of don't be afraid of a problem, just go and tackle it in a very smart way. I think that's the main thing I took from my time with McKinsey. Um, and specific about the NGO, it was a very kind of Israel unique story that I won't get into all of the details. But I think that what I learned there is the importance of making partnerships and surrounding yourself with people that are aligned with your values and that are, want your best. And some of the people that I worked there with, kind of, I'm still friends with until this very day, and are mentors of mine.
Totally. I think one thing I really like what you said about like, every problem is solvable. And also like, you just mentioned about like making partnerships and like align with like people who believe in what you believe in. And I want to double click on like sustainability part. Like since why did you choose to study sustainability and why, right now climate and health is like very important to the world. Like there's a lot of rising talent. You gave a talk on vintage stage at one point, like there's a lot of talent goes into climate, and then there's a lot of like policy changes that supports the climate direction. Why don't we talk about like why do you chose sustainability and what does that mean for currently like the new trends of like a lot of investment goes into climate and health.
Yeah, great. And thanks for the question. So, first of all, I studied sustainability because from a very young age, before it became sexy,
Mhm.
I really cared about environmental problems.
Mhm.
So, even from being a kid, and Israel had a severe water problem
Mhm.
a few years ago, and now the Israel kind of has solved its water problem a few years ago. So even just that, um, as a kid, I remember myself thinking a lot about the water in Israel. And then I traveled a lot in Israel, and I became more and more involved in this topic, but I never studied it. And then when I left the Air Force, I really wanted to follow my heart, and I told myself I don't want to just do this general MBA. I want to go and study what I really care about and what I want to dedicate my life for. And it was back like it was a decade ago, and people asked me like, why are you studying this? Will you be able to find a job when you're done with your master's? And I was like, I'm just following my heart, and I did that. And it wasn't straightforward. Now I can do whatever I want. But I think what we realize today is that indeed the climate change issue and other environmental issues are becoming the most important thing. Not the most important thing, but maybe one of the most important problems for our generation to solve. And I'm really happy that more and more people realize that this is a problem that we should all focus on. And then when I joined Vintage, so Vintage is a pure generalist fund, and we didn't have any person that leads sustainability or climate investments. And I
Mhm.
told them, let me do it. Let me kind of take control of it. And they let me. And now it's kind of it's my dream job because I tend to just invest in the topic that I care most about.
Totally. I want to double click on like, you came into vintage and then you kind of built the thesis on like climate investments. Why don't we give the audience a little bit of context of like, how do vintage invest in, you guys do fund of funds, secondary funds and like direct to like late stage deals. How is the fund structured and how did you kind of came up with the investment thesis for the climate investment strategy?
Yeah, so I'll start with explaining about Vintage and then we'll do the double click on sustainability.
Mhm,
So, Vintage is a 4 billion AUM fund based in Israel, but invests globally. So, in Israel, Europe, and the US, established
mhm.
20 years ago. Sorry, my baby. It's I have a 4 months at all,
Oh my
four
gosh.
months at home. So, you might be hearing her for a few, I don't know, seconds, but I think it will be okay. Um, so yeah,
She
so we
had
invest.
joined the conversation.
Yeah. She had things to say about sustainability. Um, so um, so we were established 20 years ago. Actually, started off as a secondary fund, and then added the fund of funds and the directs. Um, the idea about vintage, or the thinking behind it, is today is that we think that when we do all strategies together, it makes us better. So
Mhm,
we do, for example, I lead sustainability or climate and healthcare, so I do it across funds and across companies, and I do directs and I do secondaries. And so the entire team does everything, but we divide ourselves by sector. And then it's not really siloed. So when we come to a team meeting, we all discuss all deals. So we all need to have also a good understanding
mhm,
on the other topics. And the idea is that actually, so for example, if we're looking at a fund, but we're also direct investors, we have the ability not just to look at the fund high level, but to also really understand the quality of the underlying portfolio. And then also, if we invest in a fund, and most of our funds are early stage funds, then we can see, oh, this very good fund, this is like the three value drivers in that fund. And we can follow them from C to A to B, and get in touch with the CEO and also see how we can offer help. And we do that through our Value Plus, which I'll touch upon in a second. And then the idea is that we know the company so well after a few years, and we have developed this relationship and we've held the company, that when the company raises its first growth round, we are positioned quite well to invest in it. I will also mention that we really, really care about our relationships with our funds. So the idea is that we don't play aggressively. Um, um, we understand that we might miss on some very good opportunities because of that, but we are here for the long term, and
mhm,
we really cherish our relationships. And therefore, if there's a deal that is extremely competitive, we will not try to get in no matter what. We don't lead deals; we only follow, and we have like we can adapt our check size.
mm. Totally. I really love that what you said about like, you guys like would follow the company's journey from the very beginning and then in the end you invest like in the growth stage when they first like maybe open up to growth stage investing and then they're kind of like open to it. And I wonder, maybe we could chat a little bit more about like, what does a screening or like diligence process look like for call it like a fund of funds and then maybe like later stage deals or like secondary funds as
Yeah. So let's start with fund of funds.
well.
So I think the most important thing to begin with is
Mhm,
that their only top quartile funds generate meaningful returns.
mhm,
And therefore, you really need to put a lot of effort into
mhm,
identifying who those funds are, and then making sure you have access to those funds.
mhm,
And we also know that historically, historical fund performance helps with future performance, because the fund has like the brand and has the access, and probably the investors know how to pick. So most of our funds that we are invested in, you can see the funds that we're invested in, it's on our website.
mhm,
We usually, the idea is it's a lot about relationship, and if there hasn't been a meaningful change in the fund strategy or team, and the fund's performance is good, we re-up in the fund.
Mhm.
And therefore our kind of allocation to new relationships is limited because most of the fund is already kind of
Mhm.
we invested in re-ups, but still we think that investing in emerging managers is super important, not just for the development of the ecosystem, but also for our performance, because we think that the next best investors are not the usual suspects, but they're
Mhm.
probably setting up their funds now. So we are trying to meet with every fund out there, and then realize what is a good fund, and then invest in the right timing. And I'll just
Mhm.
add that we don't invest in first time investors
Mhm.
because investors need to have a proven track record, but we may invest in first time funds as long as, let's say, it's an angel investor with a track record, or an investor that has left a fund to start a new one.
For sure. So I want to double click on like what is a good track record, like that, since like if they already invest in like the top unicorn, that's like maybe too obvious a little bit. But like I wonder, so since like there's a lot of like angel investor or like emerging manager that are listening, for context, like if people have not seen like Vintage's like website, it's like literally all the top fonts logo, like oh, everything that you could like recognize. And I wonder like how do you first of all like spot these like people who when they like before they became like a household name like for these fund managers, and like what is a good track record for the people who Vintage like eventually end up investing in?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will also say for our audience, you can just Google
Mhm.
Vintage Investment Partners portfolio and you can see there all the funds and companies we invested in. So, first of all, technically, track record for mature funds, let's say
Mhm.
5+ years old, we use the Cambridge Associates benchmark. So, we can compare their TVPI, DPI, and IRR to that benchmark, depending on the vintage year. And then it tells us, if it's top quartile, it's top decile, or less than that. It becomes more difficult when you look at younger funds, with companies that have, just raised seed or A or even B. And sometimes their valuations are not indicative of the company's real performance, or sometimes it's just too early to tell. And then the job becomes more interesting and more difficult because you really need to understand the quality of the portfolio, and then it's about meeting the companies or just talking to the market and understanding the quality of those companies.
Mhm.
And we also do a lot of reference calls with both founders and other VCs and ask them what do they think about a specific fund, or who are the best funds for a specific topic, or just who are the best funds generally. So those reference calls are very, very important. And we
Mhm.
also care a lot about the strategy of the fund. So, how is it really well thought of? Why is the fund size that size? Why those stages? Why that ownership? Why that geography, etc. And then also making sure that they are doing what they said they would. And if they don't, then understand why.
Mm. Um, I wonder, so like I'm like I feel like, having the good benchmarks that you mentioned, like you would compare notes from like using like the Cambridge Associate benchmarks, and then if they're in the top, that's like basically if they're in like the top percentage. And I wonder like, so how many years and does like the manager typically have to invest before you would actually get all these data to kind of proven that this person seems like a good investor?
Yeah. So as I said, we can do a first time fund as long as the investor has a track record, and
Mhm.
usually that record should be kind of at least 5 years old
Mhm.
before you can really tell the quality of the
Mhm.
companies that he invested in.
Totally. What about like when you're doing reference calls, like since like maybe a lot of like manager that are listening, like what does the reference call typically look like? Is that like from their, if they're like a founder somewhere, like is that just to call their co-founder or investors, or like who would you call, and what kind of information would you be looking for to like decide if this is like a good person to invest in?
So I like looking at it at 4 dimensions or 4 steps
Mhm.
at a fund. It's sourcing,
Mhm.
diligencing, winning, and then adding value.
Mhm.
And and I like getting to kind of conviction across all four. Now, I think that a very good fund doesn't have to excel in all across all four parameters, but it
Mhm.
needs to excel in at least one of them and be very good at the other three.
Mhm.
Um, and then the idea is to speak to founders and to other investors in the ecosystem and really ask them about that. So, how does the sourcing work? Like, does that fund really get to see the best deals out there?
Mhm.
And if so, why? And then when they do
Mhm.
diligence, how deep is it, and how do they do that diligence? And then
Mhm.
when they pick a company to invest in, how do they make sure that they win? What are the
Mhm.
tools that they're using? And finally, with value add, that it's something that I really enjoy talking to founders about, because founders are really kind of appreciative of funds that help them, and are also quite, if funds don't help them or kind of interfere in the way, that is something that is very important for us to know, because that is a very serious red flag.
Mm. I I totally agree with you on like these like four different dimensions about sourcing, diligencing, winning, and adding value. I feel like chatting with a lot of investor on the show, a lot of people focus on like, here's like our value add. Basically, we have like a major operational team, but like there's also a lot of founder that kind of argue that sometimes like a lot of like these feedback are like not a lot like not making sense. But like I wonder, since you have seen a lot of like these different investors, and how do you, if let's say today you and I start a fund, like what would it look like from the sourcing, diligencing, winning, and adding value perspective that you feel like we could do differently than like many of these other funds out there? Like how do we kind of like um define ourselves, or like maybe if there's any interesting practices that you have seen throughout the years that you feel like people are doing extremely well in like one of these categories.
So I hope I understood your question correctly and
Mhm.
that I will answer it.
Yeah.
I think the point is that the landscape today is very, very competitive.
Hmm.
Tons of very good funds, all fighting for the very few deals that are gonna become unicorns.
Hmm.
We have researched it, did a research at Vintage, and
Hmm.
realized that across all companies that VCs invest in, so not the ones that couldn't raise money, out of those, only 3%, 2 to 3% become unicorns.
Hmm.
So, or sorry, IPO, don't become unicorns, but
Hmm.
IPO. So the percentage is very, very low. And as I said earlier, like the 75% of funds, it doesn't make sense to invest in performance wise. So it's a very tough market. And I think that if you decide you want to become an investor and you want to raise money, you really need to have a good answer to yourself, to what is your reason to exist.
Hmm.
And I think that some investors have very, very good answers. So we've
Hmm.
seen, and the beauty of it is that uh, it's not a cookie cutter. It's not
Hmm.
one size fits all. And you can see funds, you can see investors that served in like C level positions in the best companies out there, and they know what good looks like, and they know what is the help that a founder needs. And then they do that, and they go raise a fund, and they work closely with the founders. So
Hmm.
that's like one, I think, pretty obvious
Hmm.
example. Or you just see funds that really, really, really care about sourcing. So they want to make sure that they see every deal out there. They're the first. They make decisions fast.
Hmm.
Um, you see funds that are just have this ultra strong brand, that exists for 20 years, and now they need to maintain that brand. But just that brand, and as long as it remains so positive, it makes sure that they see the deals that they want to see. Um, we do hear pitches about funds having more data than others, so they can make more informed decisions. Although I must say that I think this pitch is not as strong as the others, because we usually, all of us, are exposed to pretty much the same data. Um, what else? I really think that funds that work well with founders,
Hmm.
so founders references go a very long way. I think that's super, super important. And eventually, if there's a fund that, the managers don't respect founders, don't add value, um, you know, just disappear one day, like that, they can only do it for a while until like their brand becomes really bad and the best founders don't want to work with them.
Mm. I wonder, so like, so I really like what you said about like, they have to like have great founder references. And since like I feel like it also could be it could vary since like not like every founder may need like the same kind of help. And like I wonder, since when you are doing diligence, what would be like something that you have heard that like makes you feel like, "Oh, wow, that was, like, really impressive," and, like, what does, like, the cadence look like to help founders? Since, like, a lot of the people, maybe investing in, let's say, pre-seed or seed stage that are listening, they want to help founders, but, like, they are also having a really big portfolio to, like, begin with. How does it look like to kind of like get a good reference from the founders and like like which founders like reference actually helps? Is that like the unicorn founders or is that like just generally every founder that kind of have to say something good about the person?
So first of all, we speak to all founders, and I think that
Mhm,
sometimes speaking to the ones that are really challenged and the one that didn't succeed is actually sometimes even more insightful than the successful companies, just because you see what investors look like, in the during the bad times and not just during the good times.
mhm,
So we try to have several calls. I
mhm,
think that in terms of value add, maybe the most important thing is for the investor to be transparent with the founder where when they invested and to align expectations, so the
mhm,
founders know what kind of help they're going to get.
mhm,
And it's often the case that a fund is really good and we invest in it, and eventually the help is a call once in a while.
mhm,
That's fair as long as the
mhm,
founders are not expecting more and the fund is really good at other things.
mhm,
I think that the best founder calls we've heard are from investors, for example, that are extremely involved in the setup of the company, that do the ideation together, that put the teams together, and all that. And that is, of course, a very kind of a flying colors founder F.
mhm,
But later on, you can just hear from a founder like, "This person is my first phone call,"
mhm,
or "I only speak to that founder once every couple of months, to that investor once every couple of months, but when I do, he or she gave me the best advice I could ask for."
mhm,
Or maybe that fund only helps with product, or only with go to
mhm,
market, or only with hiring, but when they do that, they really, really help me.
mhm.
So these could be examples.
Totally. I really like what you said about like, it's like sometimes speaking with the founders that are like not doing the best or like being challenged is like having a better like indicators to see if a fund manager is like super helpful or not. And I want to maybe like jump back into the conversation about like vintage. So you guys deploy between like 1 million to 50 million to different funds. And what does it look like from like a LP's perspective on portfolio constructions? Um, like I feel like a lot of emerging managers are like VCs chat about portfolio constructions, but what does it look like from the LP's perspective since you guys invest in some of the most iconic funds in the world? Um, how does like that portfolio kind of look like for you?
So again, here it's not a cookie cutter. There are
Mhm,
many ways to build a successful portfolio. I think as a general rule, we don't
mhm,
think that venture scales, so we
mhm,
prefer funds to be smaller. We don't think that you can generate a 3x return on a fund that is $3 billion in size. So we prefer it smaller. But aside for that general rule, I think there are different models.
mhm,
I will say that usually one
mhm,
of the most important thing, especially for pre-seed or seed funds, is the ownership. So
mhm,
if it's a fund that is big enough in order to write a lead check into a company, it should have 15 to 20% ownership at the beginning,
Hmm.
um, because it later on gets diluted. And it should also have money for reserves.
Hmm.
But that's again very general, because you can see very good pre-seed seed funds that their strategy is to follow, and thanks to following, they have less competition and they can get into the best deals, and they just make sure to have enough reserves and not to get too diluted. And the fund is small enough, so even if they end up having 3% in a winner, they generate good enough returns. So I think it's more about, not there. There's not one way to do portfolio construction. It's more about, you as an investor need to be super thoughtful of all the moving parts,
Hmm.
and then when you have a strategy, then actually act upon it. So
Hmm.
we did see funds saying we want to lead rounds, we want to have high ownership, and then they saw this extremely hype deal led by this ultra great fund, and then they write a small check, get small ownership, but they really wanted to have the logo of the company, and that is something that we actually think is usually a mistake.
Hmm. I think that's really interesting to hear because I definitely feel like there's a lot of advice out there to, especially if you're a small fund, you want to logo shop and then like having the right logo will attract like better deals for the future. But it's like easier. I think it's really interesting to hear from like LP's perspective on, maybe just primarily focusing on the fund return and stick to a strategy instead of being really distracted over the place. Um, I wonder, so like since you are the expert in climate, sustainability, and healthcare, why don't we talk about like right now there's a really big surge in like the climate funds or climate investing. Like, um, what's your perspective on like, things that changed? Obviously, in your speech, you talk about there is like a lot of talents shifting towards that direction, or maybe like the policy change. You mentioned like 9 different reasons. Can you give the audience a little bit like a quick overview on the climate dynamic and among all the climate funds, like what are something that you feel like are really interesting for people who may not be following the trends specifically?
Yeah, so I would say that we wrote two pieces, one about kind of the top-down thesis for climate,
Mhm.
and your talent point is there. Um, and the top-down thesis really explains the case for climate, I
Mhm.
think, well, and really create excitement. And then
Mhm.
our second piece, and we wrote it like 2 years ago, something like that.
Mhm.
Um, then the second piece is about where do climate and VC overlap, and there it's more challenging because you realize that actually, and I'm not talking here about software companies for climate, because I
Mhm.
think that's more of like a vertical SaaS play, and that's
Mhm.
something that the generalist funds could do. I'm talking about
Mhm.
like pure climate, hardware, tech, bio,
Mhm.
materials, things with with atoms,
Mhm.
because that's eventually what you need to solve that challenge. And with that, the model with VC is very challenging,
Mhm.
because it's capital intensive, because the margins are low, because the timelines are longer. So we are specifically looking for funds that know to invest in companies that know how to deal with those challenges. And that is something that is really not easy. I think that what happened, climate surge during the 2021-2022 peak, that
Mhm.
we had like endless capital in the markets, and everyone could, not everyone, but many people could raise funds, and many companies could raise $100 million in equity to set up a facility,
Mhm.
and those days are over. And so
Mhm.
you really see that many kind of tourists went back home. They're not investing anymore. And many companies today that are trying to raise money for their first of a kind facility, it's really, really hard for them. So we
Mhm.
see that the funds that invested in those companies and thought about it early on how this company will manage to raise that money for that facility, or how that money is going to generate margins that are good enough, or how is it going to get to revenues in a reasonable timeline. Um, Only climate investors that actually think about those questions before making the investment are funds that we are interested in investing in.
Mhm.
And specifically with climate, there's another challenge, and that is we spoke earlier today about the importance of track record. So there are almost no funds with track record in climate, because
Mhm,
the oldest funds invested during the clean tech period, and most of those funds didn't do well.
mhm,
And then the new funds are just too young. So that's another kind of something that is challenging for climate investors. I think maybe another point that I'll add is that we see, I think, around 200 funds
mhm,
in climate that are early stage, so doing
mhm,
pre-seed and seed. We almost don't, and then we see the giant, huge mega players that have raised like $3-4 billion funds for late stage, and that's after
mhm,
like that's really really late, so DE pre-IPO.
mhm.
Then we see a shortage of capital in the A and B rounds, and I think that's a very interesting place to play in today, just because you can invest in companies with de-risk technologies in lower valuations.
I think I really like what you mentioned about like there's a shortage between like Series A and B companies, and I wonder why do you think there's like a big gap? I would assume like the earlier stage company or earlier stage funds are, I guess, quote unquote, easier to raise as you are raising a smaller fund, and the later stage, maybe because of you have really solid track record for over 20 years, it's easier to receive the money to go for the safer route, like or and like having a bigger fund in general. I wonder like why do you feel like there is a shortage between series like A and B um in the climate investing stage?
Yeah, so I think the reason there are many pre-seed seed funds is what you mentioned. I think those are easier to raise at the beginning, and also because there was not a lot of deal flow when everybody
Mhm,
raised their climate funds 2 to 3 years ago. The climate companies only emerged, so
mhm,
everybody wanted to invest in those new companies coming up. And then I think we see those huge funds investing in really late stage companies, um, and I think they're going so late because they
mhm,
want a risk model that is like,
mhm,
show me a company with product market fit. So I wanted to have like 20, 30, $50 million in revenues. And then you're stuck with the AB rounds where companies have been on the road for a while, and it's
mhm,
climate, and climate is hard to generate revenues. So
mhm,
you have many companies with really interesting technologies and really good founders that need to raise that money for a first of a kind facility, but
mhm,
they don't manage because they don't have revenues yet. And then it's
mhm,
like a vicious cycle that they need the capital to build the facility, but they don't get the capital because they don't have revenues yet because they don't have a facility.
mhm,
And that's, it's called the first of a kind problem, or like
mhm,
FOAK, and you can read tons about it. And I think that investors that can um, in a more sophisticated way invest in first of a kind rounds,
mhm,
um, can really make good returns. And
mhm,
I think that currently it's really hard for the climate sector to succeed until that first of a kind problem is solved.
mm. I really like ways like I mean I've never heard of, well, I'm definitely gonna Google the first of a kind problem kind of situation. And I wonder how do you as a LP or as a investor who invests in later stage and fund funds and secondaries, how do you think about like when an investor reacts to trends? So for example, if this fund is an AI fund this year, next year is a crypto fund, next year is a climate fund or deep tech fund. So they kind of shifting towards like these major cycles of trends.
So it's I will try not to be too general here, but um, the idea is that on the one hand you really need to be agile and to listen to the market. And for example, generative AI is something that is truly changing the industry. So
Mhm,
I think that all of our funds had to look into it, see if they want to invest in it, and also see in their portfolios how they want to uh, embed AI within the existing company. So that's for sure. Like a fund that didn't do that, I think would have raised like question marks internally within Vintage.
Mhm.
That said, we also think that if an investor only invests in something because it's hyped and the entire market is running after it,
Mhm.
then it's not a good sign. Because if you don't have um, a good thesis around it, and usually it takes time to build a thesis around a sector,
Mhm.
and if you don't know the deal flow well, it's really easy to make mistakes. And I
Mhm.
can talk about, for example, so what we're seeing in tech bio now.
Mhm.
So bio is hard, right? And you really
Mhm.
need to understand the science around it usually. And today there is this huge hype around tech bio, especially when it's together with AI.
Mhm.
And we are seeing many generalist investors that don't know bio invest in companies in that sector just because it's hyped and in valuations that are really high.
Mhm.
And maybe there will come like a good or like two good companies out of it, but
Mhm.
generally I think that's a bit problematic.
Mm. Um, since you mentioned about like tech bio, why don't we chat about like since healthcare is your other focus, like, why don't we talk about like what is tech bio and how is it kind of like when you're investing in a fund or like secondaries, like what are some interesting things that you're seeing in this space?
Yeah, so I'll say first of all, I'm super excited about healthcare. We're getting to it a bit
Mhm.
later in the conversation, but I think healthcare today is
Mhm.
um, a place to generate very interesting returns. I
Mhm.
will also mention that our fund of funds vehicle
Mhm.
um, is broken into different sub vehicles, and one of those sub vehicles is our healthcare fund of funds. So
Mhm.
it's a smaller vehicle where we invest in funds that do 100% healthcare.
Mm.
And when we say healthcare, it's on the entire spectrum from pure life sciences and up
Mhm.
to digital health and wellness.
Mhm.
And we think there's an interesting opportunity in all. And we also wrote a publication about this, and you can see on our website on how we thought about the strategy for this fund of funds, and then also about the interesting trends within each subsector.
Mhm.
Um, so we really worked hard to try to identify the best funds in the world in each of the subsectors. And so, for example, in life sciences, we invested in Versant and Venbio. In tech bio, we invested in KDT. In digital health, we invested in Seven Wire Ventures and in Virtue, and in Amino Collective, that it's a European fund that does both digital health and tech bio. And we are still looking to do more investments. So super excited about that, and happy to elaborate more. And in terms of direct, we have seriously co-led the growth round of a company called One Step that is
Mhm.
actually democratizing gait labs. So gait is how we
Mhm.
walk. So you can
Mhm.
monitor the way you walk just with your phone in your pocket, and through that understand the person's uh, kind of rehabilitation
Mhm.
process. But also you can later on find out neurological conditions. So according
Mhm.
to how a person walks, you can actually tell if he or she are developing Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, which I
Mhm.
think is super, super interesting. So that's one step. And then we also do secondary investments. So we're invested in Ilios Health, that is doing Gen AI for mental health. We're invested in Cree, that's a European company,
Mhm.
and we will do many more secondary investments in this sector. That I think what we've seen. We're also invested directly. Sorry for not mentioning in Modern Health, that provides a mental health solution for employers, and I think we
Mhm.
will see more and more interesting, especially secondary deals, because we saw a lot of companies, you know, investing in very high valuations, and now that the market has kind of
Calm down.
regrounded, that we're seeing that we can take advantage of that and make some very interesting secondary bets, generally across all sectors and specifically in healthcare.
Mm. I would definitely try to link the article here. So like I really like that. Like so I feel like you separate them into like three big sectors. Like there's digital health, there is life sciences, and there's like tech bio. And for each of like these, I feel like number one is like you mentioned like the whole sector is very interesting. What are some like major economic trends or like trends that you feel like kind of shaped the healthcare ecosystem. And then like since like we had some healthcare investors came on our show, or like people who have invested in the healthcare ecosystem, but most people primarily focusing on like the software, or like essentially just like, you know, how like maybe using AI to assist like some of the paperwork, or like, you know, transcription from like, you know, when doctor are taking notes. Like I feel like I see a lot of these kind of innovation. And I also saw there's like maybe one or two investors, like one of the investor invests in like maybe using AI to do heart surgery, which is, I feel like that's very advanced. And there's another investor who does um they focus on like using AI to discover new drug, or like using AI to creating new solutions for things. What are like how do you think about, from an investment perspective, which level is like more appropriate right now, from like an investor standpoint? Since I know you mentioned you look at the whole spectrum, um, but I wonder, like, you know, are we very close to like having a heart surgery done by AI, or like done by a robot, like, or like how do you think about, like, you know, which part is actually realistic, and then which part you should like maybe double down on, versus like let's just invest in everything at all time to see what's going on.
Yeah, so I think it's really dangerous to oversimplify or to overgeneralize.
Mhm,
Um, and we do think that life sciences is really, really different to digital health.
mhm,
To the extent that I think we almost don't see funds that do both. We see
mhm,
maybe funds that do, like tech bio is somewhere in the
mhm,
middle. So you can see digital health doing tech bio, or life sciences funds doing tech bio.
mhm,
But besides for that, those are very, very different worlds.
mhm,
And then one can ask, like, what are the, like, and also one of, like, the second piece of that publication, we discuss the main trends or the interesting
mhm,
things to look at in those subsectors. So I think that in digital health, generative AI is really, really interesting. Actually, Bessemer just wrote a piece about vertical AI that I think
mhm,
is worth reading, because generative AI is super hyped and super interesting. It has a lot of opportunities in it, but it's also like everybody's going there, everybody's investing there, highly competitive. Not sure what are the moats of the companies, especially if it's a company, you know, that is not actually writing the foundational model. Then you really need to ask yourself, what are the moats for that company?
mhm,
And we often see that a moat is a proprietary data, for example, or distribution, or go to market. And I think that specifically within healthcare,
mhm,
um, those things are really true. Because in healthcare, in digital health,
mhm,
technology itself by itself is not enough to become a good company. And you really need to have the founder, the founder must have a very good understanding
mhm,
of the market and have very good relationships of the providers or the payers or the pharma companies that they are working with.
mhm,
So it's not like everybody can just, you know, make a Gen AI product in healthcare and succeed.
mhm,
And also, it's an industry in which Gen AI can really, really drive value. So you mentioned it, like notes, taking no doctors taking
mhm,
notes, for example. That is a huge pain point, and Gen AI can really solve it after years that people have been trying to solve and didn't manage to. Um, so Gen AI and digital health, super interesting, but again, many people are going there, so you really need to be very good at picking those companies. I
mhm,
think that another interesting area could be tech-enabled services.
mhm,
So it's less sexy, margins are lower. You actually provide services, so you sometimes even
mhm,
have to build like brick and mortar clinics,
mhm,
or have people, you know, pay salaries to people that actually provide a service. But because you can create a good arbitrage in the margins with automation, or
mhm,
just create a much better product, um, then you can build a huge business that replaces very old traditional
mhm,
companies that are, you know, that customers don't like. And that is not related necessarily to generative AI. It's just, you know, bringing tech into a very old industry. So those are just two interesting trends, really high level. There are tons of other trends, but just, you know, just wanted to mention a couple of them.
mm. I really like what you said about like, you know, understanding like the market and relationship, and then like digital health is different than um like, having basically biotech, like basically they're all like separate. And then as like people may have like different sub focus, and also like, the transcription is like a very big trend as like, although yeah, like I feel like a lot of like or like digital enablement or like healthcare enablement. I'm sorry, like I'm like trying to like looking at my notes on like while you were talking, and to like I was like taking notes to like summarize on like the like key takeaways and like differences in like these like sub sectors. As an LP, like how do you think about like building your own like thesis around these different areas? Since I feel like when chatting with a lot of investors, a lot of times that I'm getting taken away by like how much knowledge in each different domains, and I see them as like, oh, have like amazing potential. How do you kind of like came up with your own thesis on, you know, which part should invest more time and energy to? And how do you build up your own like thesis on like what should not be the part that you want to focus?
Yeah, I think again a great question, and I guess you will get different answers from different people, even within vintage, for that question.
Mhm,
I can tell you that I personally really prefer having a prepared mind for a topic.
mhm,
Um, and then when there's a specific industry that I care about, I try to meet as many funds as possible, to read as many materials as possible, to listen
mhm,
to podcasts, just to educate myself, and then to see what questions I'm left with, questions that are really hard, like the first of a kind facility that we discussed earlier, or uh, what are the moats in generative AI companies and things like that, and then go with those difficult questions and ask investors what do they think about them. And
mm,
then I feel that I can see like the very good investors that have very good answers to those questions, and then develop conversations with them,
mhm,
and then build my theory that way.
mm,
And I think it makes me stronger in both aspects, because I improve my thesis and my understanding, and in
mhm,
parallel I get to understand which funds are better than others.
mm. I wonder when you're having the conversation, like how much of the like I guess like how would you diligence on like certain aspect of like technical things, especially in healthcare and AI. Like I feel like both of them are require a lot of fundamental knowledge and like specific areas of expertise in both business and maybe sometimes like biology or engineering. What's your kind of like diligence process look like when you are diligencing on like what people are saying about an industry, like the insights that are kind of hard to understand as like a regular person?
Yeah, so I will say that I'm not a biologist. I don't understand biology well enough, and I for sure want to know biology better.
Mhm,
That said, we still invest in life sciences funds.
mhm,
It's just that there, our ability to really understand the underlying portfolio is more limited,
mhm,
and so we put a lot of emphasis on the track record, on the reference calls, on things that we can understand without understanding the technology. And then the idea is that the less it's the less it's super sophisticated, like biology or like quantum or things like that, we have a better understanding of the technology. But generally, as an investor, we know that the best investors out there don't necessarily have to know the tech like A to Z. Sometimes it
mhm,
even creates problems when people understand the tech too much. Like, you need to
mhm.
have business savvy people that do the due diligence.
For sure. I wanna like so like so since we're coming to like almost the end of the interview, like I wanna keep it maybe like one real question and then one um like major like little fire round for you. So I wonder since like you have invested in like fund of like you invest as a fund of fund and then you guys invest in secondaries and growth stage of capital, and like what do you identify as like the core skill set you need as an investor, and what are something that like you're constantly trying to improve on? as an investor?
You broke. Can you please
Oh,
repeat the
sorry.
question?
Yeah, totally. So, what is like one skill that you're constantly trying to get better at as an investor who invests in fund of funds, secondary, and um, growth stage investing? Do you feel like it's a financial analytics, or do you feel like you guys also primarily looking at the team of the investment team, or founders? Like, how do you kind of think about the day to day? Like, what is like the one skill that you feel like you constantly need to get better at as an investor?
That's a great question to end with. I think, first of all, I think that eventually people are the most important thing, and we know that with companies, we know that with
Mhm,
funds.
mhm.
That's again a very generic answer, and everybody can say that, and that's easy. So I said it, but I think it's true. But I think it's also not enough to just say that. Um, Maybe I will add that I think eventually it all, for me, most of it boils down to the quality of the portfolio. So
Mhm,
if I want to be a very good to be able to do a good due diligence on a fund, if I truly understand the underlying portfolio, and not just the high level, compare the benchmarks of the performance, then I can do a much better fund due diligence. So I think it's really about understanding the companies. And if you want to be able to understand why an investor chose a specific company, then you need to know the landscape quite well.
mm. I totally agree with you. I feel like that sounds like that's totally true. Like, your portfolio's quality defines your performance in the long run. Okay, so where are the last 1 minute fire run part? Okay, what's your favorite book?
Favorite book? I think it's Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse.
Uh, who would you invite to your dinner party?
That's hard. Who would I invite to my dinner party? Uh, we're gonna need to come back to that one. Not sure.
Oh man, this is like the first answer of no answer, but um, uh, who made the
Maybe
yeah.
I hope I pronounce her name correctly, but maybe Simone Biles, the Olympic winner.
Oh wow. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I do. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. That's so cool. Who made the biggest impact in your career?
Um, I have a mentor that is a manager for Morgan Stanley, like in Israel. So she made the biggest impact, I think.
Where can we find you outside of work?
Mountain biking.
Oh, nice. That's really cool. Okay, well, Shira, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was such a fun conversation.
Thanks much, Grace. Thanks for your time, and thanks for all the people who listened.
Awesome. Let me quickly end stream.